Training isn't something I take lightly. It is for this reason creating a training component to the Play Magnus app was so important. The best part is, this is just the first step. My team and I are looking at ways to branch out the training component for the future. In the meantime, join me by downloading my training videos and learn about some of my favorite games and problems. There's something for everyone here, from beginner to expert. I have personally selected these problems with my team. Here you can gain some tips and tricks and maybe even beat 10-year-old me. Hello and welcome to my chess app. In this first video, we would cover what you need in order to play me at 5 years old, which is basically how the pieces move and how they capture. This is the starting position. In chess, white always starts and black responds, and that's the way it is for the whole game. The pawns move like this, one square forward, except the first time they move, when they can move 2 square forwards, like this. The pawns capture diagonally, for instance, like this. The pawns cannot capture the way they move forwards. For instance, if I make this move, the pawn cannot capture like this. This is how I started out playing chess when I was very young. Just the king against the king. And it's a nice way to show how the king moves and also the way the king works in the end game. The basic goal of this game is to advance to the king to the other side of the board, and then you won the game. The king can move 1 square in any direction. For instance, from here, the king can move here. The king can move here or here. The king also captures the same way, unlike the pawns, which can only capture diagonally. The king can capture 1 square any direction it wants. The knight moves in an L shape, either 2 squares forward or 1 to the side, or 2 squares to the side or 1 square forward. The knight can also move the same way backwards, 2 squares to the side and 1 square back, or 2 squares backwards and 1 to the side. The knight also captures in the same way. It can capture forwards or it can capture backwards. The knight is a tricky piece. It's the only piece that can jump over and around pieces. For instance, if I had a queen on the same square I have this knight, the queen could not move around these pawns in any way. However, the knight can jump right around this pawn, which makes it a sneaky piece, and it can sometimes make moves that are hard to see and easy to miss. The bishop is an easy piece to keep track of. It can move diagonally in any direction, just how long it wants to go. For instance, from this square, I could capture either this pawn or this pawn, but I could also stop short here or here, or here or here. I could also move anywhere else on the board, just as far into the corner as I want. The one way you can tell if you've misplaced the bishop is if it's on another color than it started on. For instance, the bishop that moves on the white squares can never be on a dark square. while the bishop that starts on a dark square can never be on a white square wherever you want to move it. It always stays on a dark square. The rook is another long-range piece. It can move sideways, forwards, or backwards. For instance, from here, the rook can capture all the way to the other side, or it can capture all the way here. Like the bishop, the rook can move as many squares as it wants. It can stop short anywhere it wants, here, here, or here. As you see, the rook works very well on an almost empty board, because here it will have a lot of space and it can cover a lot of ground in a short time. So we just covered two powerful long-range pieces, the bishop and the rook. However, the queen is the most powerful of all. The queen can move both as a bishop and as a rook. For instance, in this position, the queen can capture a pawn like a bishop, diagonally, or it can capture sideways like a rook. That makes the queen extremely powerful and approximately equivalent to having both a bishop and a rook. The pawns are not the strongest pieces. However, the most useful function they have is that if they advance all the way to the other side, the pawn can promote into any piece you want, usually a queen. In some extreme cases, you would want to promote the pawn to another piece. Usually that would be a knight, as the queen cannot move like a knight, while promoting to a rook or a bishop is in general senseless, because the queen can move the same way as both of those pieces. In one case that it could be useful to promote to a knight is a case like this, where the king is in a square where it can be checked by a knight on the queening square, like this. And this is because time is very important in chess, and sometimes the only way you can win is by giving a check immediately. However, it must be said that this is only in extreme cases, and 99% of the time promoting to a queen is the most useful thing. We have a system of counting the value of the pieces. The pawn is worth 1 point. The knight is worth 3 points. The bishop is worth 3 points. The rook is worth 5 points. The queen is worth 8 or 9 points. While the king is not a particularly powerful piece, but if you lose the king, you lose the game. Now you're ready to play me at 5 years old. Ready to play me at 5 years old. Now you're ready to play me at 5 years old.
Ta den siste gang, men du ikke se bort på meg når jeg er ferdig. Og fortsett å se i kamera, og vær så god.
Now you're ready to play me. Oh, okay. The good thing about chess is that it's predictable, in the sense that the pieces always move the same way. However, there are a couple of exceptions to this rule. The first one is castling. Castling is a nice way of bringing the king to safety. It works this way. The king moves 2 squares to the right, and the rook 2 squares to the left. Or the king moves 2 squares to the left, and the rook 3 squares to the right. This is an excellent way of bringing the king to safety, especially if you have some pawns covering the king. For instance, like this. The king will have a very nice and safe position behind these 3 pawns. There are some cases in which you cannot castle. First of all, you'll need to remove the pieces that prevent you from castling. For instance, if there's a bishop here or a knight here, you need to move both of them before you can castle. It's important to note that you cannot castle once you moved the king or the rook on the side that you want to castle. Also, you cannot castle when you're in check, or when a piece covers one of the squares between the king and the rook. For instance, in this case, you cannot castle queenside because the bishop covers this square. But you can castle kingside because this bishop does not cover any of the important squares. The rook is in this case actually threatened, but that fortunately doesn't matter. We can castle anyway. You can still castle if one of the squares in between the king and the rook, which the king or rook does not land on, is covered. For instance, here the bishop covers this square between the king and the rook, but we can still castle safely. I usually castle early on in my games because it does 2 things. It brings your king to safety and it connects the 2 rooks. Another unusual rule in chess is called en passant. En passant is French for in passing. And that means, like in this case, when the pawn moves past the white pawn, we can still capture it diagonally, like if it had moved to this square. En passant is only available when the opponent's pawn moves 2 squares forward, and it's only available for 1 move. For instance, if the pawn moved here and we wanted to capture another piece first, for instance, let's say that the opponent had left a rook hanging, we could take the rook, but then would also lose the opportunity to take the pawn. The only instance in which you can capture en passant is if the opponent's pawn moves 2 squares forward. For instance, if the black pawn were on this square instead of on this square, and then moves 1 square forward, we could not capture the pawn. Capturing a pawn en passant happens frequently in tournaments that I play in. However, for beginners, it's one of the more difficult rules, as it's easy to forget that the pawns can act differently from how they usually do. And in my own experience, As a child playing against other children, I was frequently accused of cheating when I capture a pawn en passant. And I simply had to tell the most stubborn of my opponents to look up the rules themselves. When I played my first tournament, I was 8.5 years old. I didn't actually know how to mate with the king and rook against the king. The important thing to know is that sometimes you have to put your opponent in so-called Zugzwang, which is a German word for forced move, basically. So if the opponent was not forced to move, sometimes we would not be able to catch the king. So in this position, we would very much like to move the king one square to the side, to e5, to gain the opposition on the black king. The opposition is what it's called when the king is 2 squares from the opponent's king on the same file. But then, if we were to do that, black's king would simply escape. And on the first move, we need to be a little bit smarter. And here, we just need to give black the move. So we move the rook along the file. The king is still confined to the last 2 ranks. And now, if the king moves towards the rook, we just give a check. And because the king controls the squares in front of the black king, black has to move back. And then we follow with the king, and black is confined to the last rank, which is our first goal. So instead, black tries to escape the other way. And now we can follow with the king, because it's not possible for black now to escape. If he goes back, then we just move the rook forward, and once again the black king will be on the last rank. So black once again goes the other way. We follow with the king, and once again. Now the black king has run out of squares, it has to go back, but now white has the opposition and we can give a check, and black is forced to the last rank. He tries to escape the other way, but now we just follow again, and now we move the rook over. The black king has to continue on the same route. If it goes back, then we have the opposition once again, and we deliver checkmate. So the black king goes the other way. We follow, it's just the same procedure. King is in the corner, it has run out of squares, and once again, with the opposition king controlling all the squares, we move the rook forward, and it's checkmate. This is the next beginner's problem. When you've outplayed your opponent, it's sometimes difficult to know which pieces you need to keep in order to deliver checkmate. A common one is when there's only a king and pawns left. And what you need to do then in order to win a game is promote one of the pawns to a queen. And once you have a queen and a king against just a king, it's not that hard to win, really. By using both the king and the queen, you can step by step force the king to the last rank, and then you have many ways to checkmate. For instance, in this particular position, which is a very typical one with king and queen against king, there are actually 3 ways to checkmate. First of all, you have the so-called kiss of death, where the king has absolutely nowhere to go. Secondly, you have 2 ways to deliver the typical king and rook versus king mate that we talked about just earlier. So here the black king has once again been forced to the back rank. The king controls all the squares on the second rank. And now if the king were to move into the corner, there would be a checkmate with the 2 knights. But that is unfortunately not forced. Black can move the king the other way, and there is no checkmate. If we were to force to follow with the king, it's suddenly stalemate and a draw. And if the situation was such that instead that we just move the white knight 1 square further so that it controls the king's escape square, then the king would have to move into the corner. But now we would have no checkmate with a knight on c7, which is the only square it can deliver checkmate from. We would have to move the knight first, threatening checkmate. But unfortunately now it's stalemate once again. So there is simply no way to force the black into... There is a way to force the black king into a corner, but no way to give checkmate without stalemating. What is interesting is that 2 knights versus and the king versus king and pawn can often be winning. So were we, for instance, to put a black pawn on the board, then the situation would be completely different. Because now with the pawn there will be no stalemate, and white would be able to give checkmate with the knight on the next move. Considering that king and king and 2 knights versus king is a draw, it should not come as too much of a surprise that king and bishop versus king is a draw. And that is once again because we cannot force the black king into the corner and give a check without it being... we cannot force the king into the corner without it being a stalemate. So, for instance, we have a position like this. Once again, the black king is into the corner. We can control the only escape square that it has, but once again, it's just going to be stalemate. So, yeah, king and bishop versus a king, that's always a draw, no exceptions whatsoever. And the same goes for king and knight versus a king. This is a very economical way to give checkmate, actually, because the knight controls 1 square, the king controls a square and protects the bishop, and the bishop delivers the final check. So I should tell you that it's not easy to force your opponent into the corner in order to give this checkmate, but
And it should be noted that if we move the position to the other side, then we would not be able to give checkmate, because we would have to give a bishop check, and with the king on a dark square, it's obviously not possible to give a check with a light squared bishop. So the technique we would use here is to move the knight back, force the king out of the corner that we don't want it in. Put the knight here. The knight now controls the important square where the black king wants to go. And eventually, with good technique, we will be able to force the black king all the way to the opposite corner. But that's something we can go over later. And now, the final one. It's king and two bishops versus a king. That is something that is, I think, a bit easier than bishop and knight against the king, because the bishops can control a diagonal each. So once again we put the kings on the same square, and now, just for fun, we're going to hide the white bishops away as much as possible, just to show you the strength of the bishop by how long moves they can make and how many squares they can control from far away. So now the black king has only one square in the corner, and now we just need to give a check. The black king goes into the corner, and another check, and that's checkmate. And the two white bishops, they are so far away, but once again, they are so long range that the black king still has no escape. And that's why it is quite a bit easier with the two bishops, because they can operate from so far away.
Chess is a game of war. In order to win, you have to use all your forces in order to hunt down the enemy king. In order to checkmate the enemy king, we first have to put the king in check. Right here, the black king is in check, because the rook is pointing towards the king on this line. There are three ways in which you can defend against the check. First of all, you can move the king. In this case, you could move the king here or here, but not here or here, because then the king would still be in check from the rook. You can also capture the piece that is threatening the king. Or you can block the check. Now the bishop is covering and the king is no longer in check. In this case, the best solution would clearly be to go ahead and capture the rook, since then you would not only have defended against a check, but also won a rook. I just showed you an example of a check. This, however, is a check that black cannot do anything about, and that is checkmate. In this case, the king has no escape squares. The rook covers all the squares along this line, while the knight covers 2 squares, right here and right here. And the last remaining safe square is covered by the black pawn. And remember, the pawns can only move forward and not diagonally. They can only capture diagonally. So the pawn cannot cover the check this way. In fact, this is a bit of an unusual checkmate, but I think it's a very pretty one, since white uses such a limited force, a rook and a knight, in order to capture the black king. And it's one that I succeeded in catching my opponent with in a game many, many years ago. In the opening, there are 3 things you need to do. You need to develop your pieces to get the king to safety, and you need to fight for the central squares. In this particular example, white has done very well. He's developed all the pieces on the king side, got the bishop, the knight, and the rook into the game, while the other pieces, the bishop and the knight, are ready to develop on good, solid central squares. White also has a lot of influence in the center on all of these 4 central squares, here, 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 and here. You can see that white has influence over all of these squares with the pawns, the knight, the rook, the queen, and also the bishop, which is attacking this knight that is fighting for this important square right here. Let me show you an example of a game I played a few years ago in which both players make good logical moves towards the center. This develops the knight, preparing for castling, and fights for 2 central squares, here and here. So black does the same, essentially, covering these 2 squares and protecting the pawn. White develops the bishop, and now is prepared for castling, while also attacking the knight, which is covering these 2 important squares. Black defends the pawn and prepares to develop this bishop. White castles at the first opportunity. Black develops another knight and attacks the pawn right here. So white develops the rook, while at the same time protecting the pawn. Black develops the bishop and relieves the pin on the knight. White moves another pawn into the center, which he can afford since the pawn is attacked twice by the knight and the pawn, while it's also protected twice by the knight and the queen. And here we have a fairly standard position. This is called the Spanish opening, named after the Spanish priest Ruy Lopez, who lived in the 16th century. This is one of the most popular openings on every level, from beginners to World Championship matches. The latest one being Magnus Carlsen from 2013, in which both I and my opponent Anand employed this opening with both colors.
So, one of the things that I find fascinating in chess is that one very small detail can make a huge difference. So we have this particular position. With white to move, the position is a draw. And with black to move, white is winning. And this is because if white were to move, the only way to protect the pawn would be to move the king one square to the right. And now we have the opposition, but alas, the black king is not forced backwards. The black king has no more squares and it's not in check. That means stalemate. So, with white to move, there is simply no way to win. So, however, if it was black to move in this position, as we will soon see, then the situation would be quite different. Since now the black king would have only one possible square, and now we just move forward and get a new queen. And we already know how to checkmate with a king and a queen against the king. So this is no problem for us. Let me show you just one more thing, which is another slight difference. So we move the whole thing back one rank. Now the white pawn is one move further away from the queening square. Now with black is forced to move, but that's not a problem because there's still one more rank for it to move to. It's not forced off the board quite yet. So now white king has two squares potentially to move to forward, which is the two squares that the black king will have to abandon with the next move. But black will move just right backwards, and wherever the white king goes, if it goes right, or if it goes left, white has no other option than to move the pawn forward. But whether the king is now on d6 or it's on f6, white still has to move to e6 and stalemate the black king. The weakest square in both camps when you start out is the squares f2 and f7. That is because that particular square is only covered by the king. So if you were to attack that with two pieces, you can give checkmate. And that is where the so-called scholar's mate comes from. And I sincerely hope that none of you fall for that more than once. So it also can be dangerous to move this particular pawn early. And there's another famous checkmate which is called the fool's mate. And that goes like this. First you move, it doesn't matter with the order really, but you just have to move the f and the g pawn forward. The king has now lost all the protection along the h4 e1 diagonal. The queen moves out and boom, that's checkmate already. So a more useful way is usually to move the pawn two squares forward. This opening is called a Dutch opening, and that's actually considered a pretty decent way to play, since you control an important square in the in the middle of the board by moving this pawn forward. I'll just show you briefly what can go wrong. So one quite interesting way for white to play after this move is to move the bishop out. The idea is now to hinder black's development by pinning the queen, thereby pinning this pawn and preventing black from developing this bishop eventually. So the most played way for black is just to chase the bishop away. Bishop moves, pawn moves forward again, bishop moves. And now this is actually a very normal way to play for black, but now you just need to be careful, because you might think that white has made a huge mistake here and allowed himself to trap this bishop. But now, once again, we have the weakness of this particular diagonal when the f and g pawns have moved forward. So now we just move the pawn forward one square, attacking this pawn. And now, obviously, if the bishop is captured, it's checkmate on the next move. So black needs to cover this particular square. So the best way to do that is just to move the knight out, and then you just have to reconcile yourself that you're playing a pawn down from the get-go, which is not a nice situation to be in. But what can be even worse is to move the other pawn forward. Now you're preventing the queen from giving checkmate, because now the rook protects the pawn. And you might think that you've done something really clever, because now if the pawn takes, black can move the other pawn forward and still the bishop is trapped. So the best way for white now is to play the bishop out. Now, absolutely the only way for black to continue is to play one of these two pawns forward, either e6 or d6, to give the king an escape square. But you might think that you can also move the rook forward, protecting against the threat of checkmate in one. But now we have a simple combination, overloading the rook. So now we sacrifice the queen, the rook takes, and the lone bishop delivers checkmate against the black king, which has been so recklessly abandoned by his own pawns. Let me just show you another example on the same theme. One funny way to play the opening for black is to start by developing the bishop on the queen side, fianchettoing the bishop, as they say. Now, the best way for black to play is just to develop the pieces gradually, but it can be tempting to attack the white center immediately, and you're now thinking if white takes the pawn, you'll be able to take the pawn on g2, trapping the white rook. So, but once again, the problem is now the same diagonal as earlier, which has been desperately weakened. Now, black takes the pawn, we give a check. Black has to move the pawn in between. And now the only way for black to play is to put the bishop on g7 in order to give the black king an escape square. But that's still very good for white, but I'm not going to go into details on that right now. But instead it might look very natural to just move the knight out, attacking the queen, and if the queen moves away, you can simply capture the rook, and you'll be a rook up. However, white has one very tempting option, which is to give a discovered check. And now black will have to take the knight, the queen, obviously. Now we'll promote, take the rook, and have a completely winning position now, both threatening the knight and checkmate in a couple of ways. So black will have to give up the knight with a lost position. But often when there is a very good option, there's an even better option, and here we can actually, with another discovered check, we can deliver checkmate in 2 instead. So once again we sacrifice the queen, and now the lone bishop is enough to checkmate. One of my favorite themes in chess is the king walk. So in the end game, when the queens are off, the king becomes a very important piece because it cannot be checkmated so easily, and it can be used in order to invade the opponent's position. And as we have seen earlier in the beginner problems, it's absolutely essential to use the king towards the end of the game to help checkmate. However, in the middle game, when there are lots of pieces on the board, the king is usually very vulnerable when it moves up the board. And this is an example of a position where the king can actually be used in the attack in the middle game, and that's why it's unusual, and also that's why it's fascinating. So this is a game, very famous game, Short versus Timman, and there are some important factors here that allow white to think of a king walk, which is that he controls the only open file on the board. The dark squares around the black king are extremely weakened, since all his pawns on the king's side are on dark squares. I mean light squares, and it's very hard for black to move. Really, most of his pieces are tied down in defensive positions. His bishop and the queen, they need to stay on the long diagonal over here in order to threaten checkmate, because otherwise white could just move the knight forward and create an irresistible threat against this pawn. So now it's actually fairly simple once you see it, that white can just move the king forward. So what happened in the game was that black didn't find a response, just played the rook over here, the white king kept on walking, rook moved back, king goes, bishop is threatening the rook, but that's way too late. King goes to g5, and if the rook is taken, then continues with irresistible mate on the next move. So it's really nice when the king ends up here in the middle game, and this is sort of the classical example of this. I've had many king walks in my own games. I've been inspired by this game and others, and I'll just show you one where I tried to do perhaps just a bit too much. Here I actually tried to deliver the same checkmate in a blindfold game against a very strong opponent. So and that was just too ambitious, unfortunately. Against the Spanish player Paco Vallejo, I've had sort of a slight advantage for most of the game. Now we've both gotten into time trouble, and suddenly I saw this brilliant way of winning the game. So first, just like in the game we saw, I moved the queen closer to his king, tying down the rook to the defense of this pawn, otherwise it would be checkmate in a couple of moves. And now I'm just intending to walk all the way with the king. Unfortunately, I'd missed something very simple. He just gave a check, took a pawn. I kept on walking, blindfolded. I thought I was winning here, but I was walking too close to the sun this time. So he gave a check. I blocked it with a pawn. And he gave another check, and finally I realized that once I get the king over here, I'm probably the one who's getting checkmated and not him. If it was my move, then of course I would checkmate him, but in the game I lost instead. I've had some fascinating games with king walks that I show you later. My favorite one is the one I played against Alex Husman in the European Club Cup in 2008, but we'll get to that later. So we have another famous chess theme, which is called the fortress. So in the present position, white has a number of advantages. He has a knight against a bishop, which is not usually an advantage, but it's an advantage in a position that is as closed as this one is. There are no pawns removed from the board, and there are no obvious pawn breaks. And basically all the black pawns are on dark squares, which make it very difficult for the black bishop to find good work. Black tried a little trick. He moved his queen to b6, which looks absolutely ridiculous because the queen can now be captured. The point is that now black's pawn structure is tidied up. It's now pretty blocked, and he'll just need one more move before the position is completely blocked and drawn despite white's extra queen. So the white player in this game, who is a very strong grandmaster, he went for this position nevertheless. He captured the black he captured the black queen. Obviously he saw that if black were to close the position, this would be a pretty clear draw, but he thought he had a clever way to break through. He moves the pawn forward, and the idea is now just to move the queen over here, and once the queen infiltrates, then the game is absolutely over. So black captured, he went with the queen, trying to get here, but he had overlooked the fact that black can simply move the pawn forward. Now, if he doesn't do anything, the black pawn will move forward again, and there's nothing white can do. So he took it, but now the trap is shut, h4, and the bishop controls all the squares on the only open file on the board, and there's simply no way for white to make progress. So, in fact, in the starting position, white could have won the game probably pretty easily by just rerouting his pieces instead of taking the queen, just by focusing on the weak point of black's position. So there really isn't that much that black can do. White will move the king forward, move the knight away. Once again, we're not taking the black queen because that would lead to a fortress. Now we move the king up, and next we can just capture this pawn, which cannot be defended. And let's say we were to give black the option of defending the pawn with the king and the queen. We would just move the knight over here, attacking this pawn once again and winning the game easily. It should be noted once again how desperately helpless the black bishop is. It's not possible to get into the game at all with all the pawns on black squares.
I've always been fascinated with chess history. One of the greatest players of the 19th century was the American Paul Morphy. There were a lot of things they didn't know about chess in the 19th century, but one thing they did know is how to attack and how to play for the initiative. And the game I'll show you right now is an excellent example of that. In this situation, Morphy, as white, has developed a number of pieces very actively, while black has only developed the queen and the knight, and his position is therefore less developed and vulnerable. In the current situation, black has just moved the pawn here, attacking this bishop. The point of this move is that black wants to develop the knight to this square and subsequently move it here, attacking the white queen, which is a little bit short of space. If we do this immediately with black, he would lose 2 pawns, like this, attacking the rook. And white has won 2 pawns and weakened the black position. So instead, first he moves the pawn 2 squares forward, defending the pawn and also attacking the bishop. If the bishop were now to retreat, for instance here, black could develop the knight and he'd have a pretty solid position. So here, Morphy realized that he needs to use his initiative right now. And so, without any consideration for material, thinking that the knight is more important than the pawns, he captured the pawn. Black captures back, and white captures. This is the first little gain for white. In this way, white manages to keep the initiative as black is now in check. And in order to block the check, he either needs to move the king or to pin his own knight. Morphy's opponent chose to pin his own knight. Now, Morphy brings another piece into play, the rook, which is now attacking the knight, and gets his king to safety at the same time. If it were white to move right now, he could capture the knight with his bishop, and black could not recapture in a satisfactory way, as the knight right here is pinned by this bishop. So white could take the queen and win the game. So Morphy's opponent, he could do the same and castle queenside. But then, since his pawns are not here to protect his king, the king would be hopelessly exposed, and white could checkmate in 2 moves, like this. And the king is dead. The only square that the king could conceivably move to here is covered by the white rook, which just got into play. So Morphy's opponent instead decides to protect the knight with his rook. Morphy loses no time and captures the knight with his rook. The point now is that black cannot still take with the knight, since the knight is pinned by the bishop, so he needs to recapture with the rook. And now white brings another piece into play, and this square is once again overloaded, since there is no other rook black can bring into the play, since his pieces are not developed yet. So his opponent tried to instead exchange the queens in order to possibly survive a few more moves in an endgame like this. Although with 2 pawns more and active pieces, white would still probably win the game. However, Morphy was in no mood to play an endgame, and he saw a way to end the game more quickly. He captures the rook. His opponent was probably pretty happy with that, since now he can finally recapture with the knight without having to worry about the pin, since the queen just moved out of that. However, his lack of development is still going to be his undoing, as Morphy uncorks another little surprise. Queen here. The only way that black can defend against the mate is to take the queen. But now, finally, it's checkmate with the rook and the bishop instead, since all the remaining squares are covered by his own pieces. Once again, black did not survive the opening. In this game, we saw how effective pins can be. There were a number of pins in this game, both against the king and against the queen. But most of all, this game shows you how one should not neglect the development of the pieces, and when your opponent neglects the development of the pieces, you should never give your opponent a break and constantly attack the uncastled king. And that really is one thing Morphy did extremely well, as did many other great masters of the 19th century. Now I'll show you an example of one of the most fascinating things in chess, the king hunt. The black king has lost one of the pawns in front of him, but covered by a bishop, a queen, a rook, and a couple of pawns, the king still seems fairly safe. However, with the queen sacrifice, the black king can be drawn out on the board. Now, the bishop is captured with a double check from the knight and the bishop, and so naturally the knight cannot be captured, while if the king retreats into the corner, black is suffocated and thus checkmated. So, black needs to go on a walk with his king, and now the king hunt begins. So white is a queen down, so he needs to checkmate. So every move from now on needs to be a check. Once again, black really has only one square here. In the game, white chose an elegant way to checkmate in 5 moves. In fact, there's an even faster one, like this. Check. And now we can do 2 useful things as one. We can castle into safety and give checkmate at the same time. The king is trapped inside the enemy camp and it has no squares. While if the king goes back, then we use the pawn to checkmate it. While if black doesn't capture the pawn and goes here instead, it will also be trapped after another check. Remember, once again, we're a queen down, so every one of our moves needs to be a check. Check. Now black has just one remaining move to block the check with the long-range bishop. And now black is checkmated as the bishop has blocked the only remaining square the king could escape to. In the game, white chose a slightly longer, but perhaps more elegant way to checkmate. Now on every move, black just has one square, so his choice is very limited. Check. Now the king has been forced all the way over to the other side with absolutely no help from its own pieces. So it's really no surprise that white can checkmate in a couple of ways. One, it can castle when the rook gives a check and the king is trapped. Or can just move the king, uncovering an attack from the rook when it's equally trapped. And actually, that's what white decided to do in our game. The black king has had a brave run right into the enemy camp. Such king runs are very seldom rewarded, and usually the king ends up being checkmated like it did in our game.
So this is just an example from one of my recent games from the Sinkfield Cup against Wesley So. In this game, I'd sacrificed the pawn in the opening. I'd gained really a good compensation with stronger minor pieces, and eventually a bit of a bind on the king side. Can now see that my very advanced pawn on h6, which is eventually what won me the game, it's very dangerous. If his pawn drops at any time, that will be absolutely disastrous. So he'll have long-term problems here, in spite of the fact that he was just recently a pawn up. In this position, I have to be honest, I had for a couple of moves kind of panicked because I'd seen that he could pin my queen by playing queen to b7, and now for a long time I didn't know what to do, and I was just sitting there really shaken because I thought I'd turned a very good position into a losing one, but at the same time it felt like my position should still be very good, so there had to be something. And while he was thinking, for me, a surprisingly long time, it just occurred to me that the solution is extremely simple. And I'm sure that many of you will find the right solution in a very short time. But this just goes to show that in a game, it is sometimes more difficult when you're not looking in the right place. So I was looking at all sorts of different possibilities, pushing the pawn, but then he can move his rook to c7, attacking the knight once again, and I'm in big trouble. Or to even possibilities like c3, b takes c3, b4, trying to support the knight on the next move, and if bishop b4, then king c2, trying to get the rook to b1. But of course, as many of you have seen by now, the solution is much simpler than that. Just take the bishop, pawn takes, and checkmate. So pretty simple two-move combination, but it just goes to show if you're not looking in the right place, then you might never find it. And who knows, if he had made his move instantly, instead of taking some time when I eventually found the combination, then I might have been in trouble. So this is a game I played many years ago, actually more than 11 years ago now. It's still one of my favorite combinations. It's my game against Vladimirov from Dubai 2004. So in the opening I'd half sacrificed, half blundered a pawn, but I had gotten very good compensation here with better development and potentially a strong attack against his king. So he played queen to c6, offering a queen exchange. I moved the queen back. I put the knight on h5, attacking g7 later after he moved his bishop. And basically I just broke through on the king side and won a pretty nice game. But I can still remember how I was trembling with excitement that he might instead play bishop to c6. And now my idea was to play the queen to e2. He'd take the rook, and I'd capture on e6. Now this obviously looks very dangerous for black, and if he does take the knight, I will take back. He'll have to put the bishop in between. I'll give a check, and there will be mate on the next move. So the only way for him to resist is to put the queen in between. So none of my really obvious options work now, like taking on a6, because then he'll simply take my knight and the attack is over. So here again I need to be creative, and just the feeling when I found the idea. Bishop to f5 was amazing. And now, still the white threat might not be that obvious, but it's just impossible for black to prevent the idea of, let's say we move the bishop somewhere, the idea of a check on d8, taking with either the queen or the rook will lead to the same result, knight c7 and checkmate. So this is really one of the combinations that I'm very happy about. I don't get to checkmate my opponent in every game. I didn't get to do that in this game either, but just the feeling of finding this combination, it's really not that difficult. I just found it very aesthetic and yeah, it's something that you usually find in exercises, not in real games. I really like to study the games of the masters of the past. Obviously, games with brilliant combinations are a lot of fun, but I also really like games with more positional play. And this is a game of former world champion Anatoly Karpov, and his style is and his games in general, I find very impressive. And this game, although his opponent in this game, in the candidates matches, Boris Spassky, didn't play particularly well in this game, still it impressed me, and I think it has impressed many others. As a prelude to this game, it should be noted that Spassky had beaten the young Karpov with black in the first game of this match in '74 on the black side of Scheveningen defense, and in this game Karpov gained his revenge. So in this case, looking at the black position, his position is not very attractive. There are a number of potentially weak pawns in the black position. His light squares are weakened. The white queen has taken up a very nice post. Cannot be attacked by any pieces, and offering a queen exchange is hardly attractive for black. So it's a very nice position. The only sort of badly placed piece for white is this knight. And it should be noted that a knight on c3, it's always well restricted by a pawn on c6. And vice versa, like in the Ruy Lopez, a knight on c6 is well restricted by the knight on by a pawn on c3, which is why many of those positions are a little bit easier to play for white, and that's one of the reasons why black often reroutes the knight via e7 to g6. Anyway, Karpov played a very nice move here. He played the knight to b1. Now the knight is searching for greener pastures. If the rook now captures on d2, the knight will capture and reach better squares, either c4, f3, or even maybe b3 and then to c5. There are many nice options, and it's hard for black to do something. So we'll sort of skip commenting on Spassky's moves further on in this game. As I said, they weren't really brilliant, but already his position is difficult, and as we all know, it's difficult to find good moves in bad positions. So here Karpov decided that even though exchanging the rooks, getting the knight to d2 is nice, it's even nicer to keep the rooks, and we'll see why very soon. So Spassky continued now. He's anticipating a attack on f7, so he moves the rook back, protecting the pawn. And now Karpov just continues improving his knight with the help of a little tactic. It might look like the pawn is hanging, but that is not the case. Knight goes to f3, and with a discovered attack on the queen and an attack on the bishop as well. So instead, Spassky felt that he had to move back, bishop to d8, knight to f3. But now it's sort of going automatically for Karpov, since now the pawn is attacked on e5. And although the knight will sort of be passively placed on f3 with the black pawn on f6 restricting it, once again the same thing as with the pawn on c6, it won't matter because he's already way too active here. And now bishop e6, bishop e7, queen e6, all very nice and logical. Rook to d1. Actually, Karpov took first. Once again, little combination, positional tactic, positional considerations aided by tactics. Now, if Spassky would have taken with the rook, Karpov could just have taken on e5, and if that is captured, then rook f7 with a very simple mate. So he had to take with the bishop, but now it's all completely forced. Rook to d1, threatening completely lethally rook d7, knight to b8, only way to threaten that and not lose the bishop. Bishop to c5, rook goes away. Rook goes away, and now just rook takes d8, and he resigned because of rook takes d8, bishop e7 with a double attack on the f6 pawn and the rook. And after that pawn is captured, mating the black king will be the easiest task in the world for Karpov. I like playing endgames. I won lots of points in the endgames over the last few years. When I was little, I used to lose points in the endgame, but then I learned, and eventually I'm becoming the one who gains half points, whether it be drawn games won or sometimes even lost games drawn. And one of my favorite themes in the endgame is rook. When the rook is on the wrong side of the pass pawn, somehow that has, in rook endgames, that has always fascinated me, and the main reason for that is the game I'm going to show you right now. My game against the Czech Grandmaster Racek in the German Bundesliga in 2007. So if you were to switch around the positions of the rooks here, let's just put the white rook on b2 and the black rook on b8. The position would be an easy win for white, since the black rook is completely immobile, and we can just march over it with the king. Obviously, with the rooks in the places that they actually are, this is not possible, because then the white king will simply be checked. So something more clever is needed, and I really like the idea that happened in the game. So Here I played the king to d6. Obviously black needs to protect the e5 pawn, otherwise this cluster of pawns will quickly become pretty mobile. So he protected it with the king. It should be noted that if he protects the pawn with the f pawn, I will simply play rook to e8, rook takes b7, rook to e7, rook takes, king takes, with an easily winning pawn endgame. For instance, king to g6, king to f8, there's nothing to do except push the pawn. Takes g4. If the king moves backwards, I just go king to g8, forces king away again, and then grab the pawn, so he has to go forward, but then once again he's not in time, and now it's important just to play king to f5 rather than capture any of the pawns, and wherever he goes I capture the pawn the same way as the black king goes. So so he played king f6 instead, which is the only chance. And now quite a bit of imagination is required to win the game. Obviously, rook h8, rook takes b7, rook h6, king g7 is not enough because I need to move the rook. I cannot take this pawn, and my extra pawn would be basically meaningless. So instead, already a long time ago, I had found this idea, but obviously I needed to verify whether it actually worked. So I played f4. I remember one of my teammates, Peter Svidler, he told me after the game he didn't know what I was doing, whether I was trying to lose the game, but then when he saw my idea, he sort of calmed down. So he has no choice but to take it twice. Now comes the point of my idea, rook to g8. Obviously with the point rook b7, e5, and checkmate. So he has only one option, which is rook to b6, rook takes b7, king takes b7, and now f3. There are a couple of ways for white to win here, but by far the most elegant, I think, was the way that I chose, which is the same idea again. King to c6, and if he advances with the pawn, king to d6. And once again, is checkmate. So instead he chose king to e5, but now e8, king f4, king d5, and rook to f8 on the next move. It's completely lost. So I guess it is quite a bit better to have the rook behind the passed pawn than in front of it. But this game goes to show that there are many resources, and that even in simple endgames it's often possible to play for a mate. And that is one of the fascinating things really about endgames. And every time I have the possibility since to get the rook in front, I'm always looking for getting the rook in front of the pawn and trying some theme like this, because the nice thing about having the rook in front of the pawn is that the opponent's rook can never move away from that particular file, because then the rook will move away and the pawn promotes. So it decreases your options, but also decreases your opponent's options. So remember always to look for checkmate even in endgames.
Now I'll show you the end of something called the evergreen game in chess. A game played in the 19th century where they typically played chess like this, both players ferociously attacking and not caring particularly about king safety or considerations like that. Both players have neglected defense, and all the white pieces are attacking. The queen, the bishop, the rooks, they are all pointing towards the center, while his king, still covered by pawns, is also attacked by a lot of pieces. The bishop, the queen, which obviously cannot be captured because of the pin, and the rook. And basically for white, there is no defense against mate. So from here on, our every move needs to be aggressive and it needs to be a check. So our first move, although spectacular, it has to be the only check available. Now, the most natural thing for black to do is, of course, to capture back. And now black also involves one more of his pieces into the attack, the bishop, which is now pointing on the long diagonal, since the knight is no longer obstructing. And once again, we have to give a check. And now, the only check that is available is to take this pawn with a queen. It might look weird to give up a queen, but now, as black obviously cannot move his king, since white would have a couple of ways to give checkmate, black has to capture. And now the beautiful thing is that we have a couple of ways to give a double check. One way is to go here with the bishop, attacking the king and also uncovering the rook. However, now black can escape this way, and the attack is over. So we need the other discovered double check, which is this one. Now black's choice is really limited. Obviously, in a double check, he needs to move the king. So either here, when we gave a checkmate in 2 moves, or and to go here when there's a slightly more surprising but still very beautiful checkmate like this. The bishop is covered by the rook, and the squares that the rook and the bishops don't cover are obstructed by black's own pieces. This once again shows the value of initiative and time in chess, even in a position like this, which appears hopeless since the white king is attacked and his 2 knights down. But still, when all your pieces are attacking an uncastled king and there are checks available, there will always be chances. One of the most fascinating and creative players of all time was the 8th world champion, Mikhail Tal, from the Soviet Union and Latvia. He would dazzle and confuse his opponents with brilliant attacks, sometimes incorrect, but also very often just brilliant attacks that his opponents did not see coming at all. And this is one of them. This looks like a fairly standard position that can arise from the Sicilian defense. And Tal is playing white in this example. And he's attacking with his pawns on the king side, which is usually where the black king is in the Sicilian. So, in order not to lose a pawn, for instance like this, and black cannot recapture since white is covering this square with both the bishop and the queen. He decided to capture like this first. Tal recaptures and renews the threat against the knight while opening the h file. Now black could keep a fairly decent position by moving the knight here, but probably he was concerned about the possible pin on the file against his rook, so he decided to exchange rooks first, expecting Tal to take back when he could cover the file without having to worry about the pin on his rook. However, Tal had seen something else, a very unusual combination. He took the knight instead. Normally, that would be a very bad idea, since while white is threatening two pieces, the rook and the bishop, black can capture the rook with check, and normally if white recaptures with either the queen or the bishop, black would just recapture the pawn and be an exchange and the pawn up. However, in this particular case, Tal had seen something different. He recaptures with a knight, and once again we have one of the most important themes in chess: double attack. White is threatening both to capture the queen and the bishop. So in order to defend against both threats, black needs to capture the queen. The problem now is that white captures the bishop, and since all the black pawns and other pieces inhibit the king, it's impossible to stop white from queening on the next move. It should be noted that if black had not moved his rook earlier on, he could have castled and prevented the pawn from queening, or even better, he could have first captured a knight with check, selling the queen as expensively as he can, and then castled when black would block the pawn and eventually win the game. But since the rook is developed, it has moved already, there is no way to defend against the queening of the pawn. Black could try to make room for his king, but then white would not only get a queen with check, he would keep the initiative, and now the queen is still threatened, while if the queen moves, it will be checkmate in 2 moves. And the king is trapped. Did you spot the combination? If not, don't worry. This is one of the most difficult things to do in chess, since when your opponent captures one of your most valuable pieces, the instinct is to immediately recapture. But this just goes to show that if you have the time, it's worth taking just a few seconds to consider if there might be something even better. And once in a while, an amazing combination like this will be available. I've shown you some games from the 19th century with amazing mutual attacks in which one player was spectacularly checkmated. In the 20th century, people started to defend better and play more of a positional chess. And then sometimes more subtle means were necessary in order to win games. One thing people realized is that chess is not only a tactical game, but it's a positional game. Sometimes you need to think not only of how to attack, how to checkmate your opponent, but also to think of what your opponent wants to do and how to prevent their ideas. This is an example of Zugzwang, which means that your opponent basically has no move that does not worsen their position. Here, in this particular case, played by one of the really great players of the early 20th century, Nimzowitsch, who loved the ideas of restricting his opponent's pieces, is black, and he sacrificed, as we can see, a minor piece for 2 pawns. Nevertheless, it's not hard to see that black is doing very well. Every one of his pieces are very active. The pawns are demobilizing the bishop, the queen, and the rooks. And the knight is completely immobilized by this pawn and the bishop, while the black rooks and light square bishops are very aggressively posted, while the bishop is pointing towards the king and the queen can join the play whenever it feels right. There's really only one thing left to do. It's to make a move that asks white the question, what do you want to do next? And the most elegant way is this little move. It takes away the white's queen only potential escape square, which is a g5 square, and it puts white in basically absolute Zugzwang. So white can make a couple of more pawn moves, like this, trying to free the knight. Black just supports the pawn. And the knight is still completely immobilized. White can move this pawn, but black is just going to move back and forth until there are absolutely no moves left. Really, absolutely no moves left. The knight obviously has no squares, as they are all either protected by the pawn or inhibited by his own bishop. This rook has no squares. The only square it can go to, it will be captured by the bishop or the rook. The bishop has no squares. If it goes here, black goes here, and because of this little pawn move, the queen is trapped. The dark square bishop only has one move here, but then the knight is no longer protected, and white has lost a knight while not really improving his position. If white tries to attack the rook, then black has an elegant win. Now the bishop has gotten even more scope, and if white captures the rook, it will immediately be checkmate. All that is left really is the rook, which has 2 squares where it cannot be captured, but wherever it goes, here or here, the queen will be trapped. And the queen also has absolutely nowhere to go without being captured. So, in the position after h6, the German Semisch, who played white in this position, who was actually a very strong player and a grandmaster, realized that there was nothing to do, and he resigned. Putting your opponent in Zugzwang is one of the most satisfactory feelings in chess, and I hope you'll get the chance to do that someday. I'll show you another example of our hero of the last game, Nimzowitsch. However, this time he's on the wrong side, as his opponent is the great Alexander Alyekhin, the world champion who beat Capablanca in a match in 1927. With the exception of the years 1935 till 1937, he reigned till his death in 1946. Here, Nimzowitsch has a fairly solid setup with black. He has a limited amount of space, but nevertheless his position seems reasonably solid. The only problem is that this knight is under a lot of pressure. And Alyekin has doubled his rooks on the file, attacking the knight and also the bishops. And now he brings the queen around, once again attacking the knight and setting up the so-called Alyekin's gun, in which your queen and two rooks are lined on the same line, attacking a single point, which can be extremely powerful. Black has only one way to protect the knight. Now, the problem is for black that after white moves the bishop, white is threatening to attack the knight again with a pawn. And when you attack the knight with a less valuable piece, there is immediately trouble. And although after the pawn gets here, the pin on the queen is removed, the pin on the rook is still there, so black will lose material, as his rook is only defended twice and attacked 3 times. So the only measure black has, a desperate one, is to move the pawn forward, which essentially just gives up a pawn for nothing, but gives him a little bit of time to get over with the king and protect this rook. Threatening this again, but now black protects the rook. So now, if white were to push the pawn forward, black could move the knight, and he would still be, to some extent at least, in the game. But, as in our last game, when Nimzowitsch was the hero, black essentially has no useful moves. And Alyekin underlined this by just moving his pawn forward, eliminating any possibility of black advancing g5 at some point. And here Nimzowitsch resigned. Since the rooks cannot move, the knights cannot move, the queen cannot move, the king cannot move, every one of those pieces are needed in order to either protect the c6 square or, in the king's case, the c7 square. And he's only going to have one more pawn move when white can do whatever he wants, for instance, move the king. Now black has just one pawn move left. And here, to add insult to injury, white even gets a beautiful square for his knight, intending to give a check, and then to go here after black has moved his king and capture the rook with terrible material losses for black. So here Nimzowitsch decided that there was nothing more to do. He's going to be in Zugzwang on the next move, and he resigned.